Hello and welcome. My name is Matthew, and today we are going to be looking at the randomized controlled trial data published by Pfizer that initially got the mRNA vaccine approved by our regulatory bodies. We will also be looking at some of the bigger questions regarding COVID, such as what your worst case scenario with it was. Finally, we will be also looking at some pertinent information regarding the choice to take the vaccine. So here we have the trial data in front of us. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The title of the paper is The Safety and Efficacy of the mRNA COVID-19 Vaccine. So let's just get straight into it. So this is an ongoing multinational placebo-controlled observer-blinded efficacy trial. And again, if we want to look at scientific evidence, let's just call up quickly our hierarchy of scientific evidence. Again, this goes from the weakest to the strongest. And randomized controlled trials, as you can see, sit pretty much near the top. The only higher level is what is known as a meta-analysis and systematic review, which is where we combine multiple randomized controlled trials and then assess the accuracy of those. Now, to continue with the methods, they randomly assigned people 16 years or older to receive 2 doses, 21 days apart, of either the placebo or of the vaccine. The primary endpoints that were measured was the efficacy of the vaccine against lab-confirmed COVID-19 and the safety. Let's look at their conclusion. The conclusion of their paper was that the 2-dose regimen of the vaccine confirmed 95% protection against COVID-19 in people who were 16 years or older. The safety was followed up for a median of 2 months, which is interesting. Another thing to highlight is that it was funded by Pfizer themselves, so the drug company that was set to profit from these vaccines were the ones that done the trial data. So I'll leave that up to you if there's any bias involved in that. Just on a side note, Pfizer earned something like an extra $100 billion over the last couple of years. So I'm sure that didn't influence anything at all. And let's scroll down to get into where this 95% vaccine efficacy figure comes from. So, among 36,523 participants who had no evidence of existing or prior SARS-CoV-2 infection, there were 8 cases of COVID-19 with onset at least 7 days after the second dose, and there were 162 cases among placebo recipients. This case splits corresponds to their 95% vaccine efficacy figure. So let's break down that a little bit further. So again, we're looking at the statistics of the Pfizer trial data itself. Initially, of those 43,500 people, some of them got COVID, and so we're excluding those. So people who had no evidence of existing or prior infection was that 36,500 figure. So that figure was split up into 2, so there's going to be the vaccine group and the placebo group. The number who received the vaccine was 18,198. And again, remember, there was 8 COVID cases amongst them. The number who received the placebo was 18,325. And remember, there was 162 people who got COVID in that group. And again, so that total number of COVID cases was 170. So this was the randomized controlled trial data had 170 cases of COVID. And this is what your regulatory bodies thought was sufficient to approve these vaccines. Now, if you think that number's high enough, I'll leave that up to you. Now, how do we calculate vaccine efficacy? So, vaccine efficacy, or the effectiveness, is the percentage reduction of disease cases in the vaccinated group compared to people in the unvaccinated group. This is calculated from something known as the relative risk, and there's a very simple formula for calculating this. The vaccine efficacy is 1 minus the relative risk, and then you times that by 100 to get the percentage. And again, that's easily found here, even amongst Wikipedia. That's where that vaccine efficacy formula comes from. And again, that's not debated. That is standard practice. Now, what is the relative risk? The relative risk measures the difference in absolute risk, which is a very critical figure for us to understand, between the 2 groups. So we calculate it from having the absolute risk of the vaccine group divided by the absolute risk of those who had the placebo. Now, the absolute risk of the vaccine group which we have here, is the 8 cases divided by that some 18,000, which gives us a figure of 0.044%. The absolute risk of the placebo group, if you remember, there was 162 cases of that, about 18,000 people. That gives us a figure of 0.884%. So the relative risk is, again, we divide those. It's the 0.044 divided by the 0.884, which comes out about 0.5, or 5% is another way of saying that. And from our simple formula of vaccine efficacy, we do 1 minus the relative risk times by 100 to get our percentage. So 1 minus that 0.5, which gives us 0.95, times by 100, which is where we get the 95% vaccine efficacy. What is the absolute risk reduction? So this is maybe a more important figure for people to understand in terms of their individual risk reduction. So relative risk is something that it can exaggerate the benefit of certain drugs. And so it's important that when you're having your conversation with your doctor, that he express to you what the absolute risk reduction is. And again, it's very simple to understand. It is the absolute risk of events in the placebo group minus the absolute risk of events in the treatment group. And again, we figured those out were, again, the absolute risk in placebo, 0.884, minus the risk of the treatment group, of the vaccine group, was 0.44. So your absolute risk reduction, and this is coming from the Pfizer trial data itself, was 0.84. So the risk reduction from getting the vaccine for you individually, based on their scientific data, is less than 1%, 0.84%. After finding out from your doctor what your absolute risk reduction was, you may want to ask, well, what's my worst case scenario with COVID? What are the chances that I could actually die if I caught COVID-19? Thankfully, we have up-to-date scientific information on that as well. So this was the paper that was published at the start of this year, January 2023, which looked at the age-stratified infection fatality rate of COVID-19. So the infection fatality rate is what we're looking for when we're trying to figure out if you catch a disease, what's your chance of fatality, i.e. your chance of dying. And again, this was published by what may be considered the best biomedical researcher in the world, Professor John Ioannidis. I did a breakdown of this paper in a different video, which I can link to as well. So if you want a more in-depth look at this, please look at that video. But the information from this I've got written down. So let's scroll down to that. So the worst case scenario, again, is the infection fatality rate, your chance of dying. As we know, this was stratified by age, as those who were younger who had much less risk from COVID compared to those who were older. For somebody like myself, who was under the 30-year-old age bracket, my infection fatality rate was 0.002%. You can look at the figure for your own age bracket. A third question you might have had with your doctor was, anytime you get a new drug, you may want to know what the number needed to treat was. So let's look at that. So the number needed to treat is the number of patients you've got to give the drug to in order to prevent one additional bad outcome. Thankfully, we also have up-to-date information on this published by the UK government. So let's have a little look of where this comes from. So again, this is the estimation of the number needed to vaccinate to prevent a COVID-19 hospitalization. This was done for the primary vaccination, so that's for those 2 shots. For the booster, which was the 3rd, as well as the autumn 2022 one, which was the 4th. And again, it also has information regarding the spring booster, which is the 5th one. This was published on the 25th of January of this year. Now, it looked at things like the rates of COVID-19 and severe COVID-19 hospitalization per million. Severe here was taken to mean there was codes to indicate the use of, say, oxygen or ventilation and admission to the ICU. So if you went to hospital and you needed even something just like oxygen, that was included as meaning severe. So if we scroll down, we come up to table 1. You can look at this information for your own age bracket as well. So this is the rates per million of COVID-19 hospitalization and severe COVID. So for somebody in my age group, severe hospitalization for under 30s, for people who were unvaccinated, was still less than 1 in a million. Now, the number needed to treat, which is what we were trying to focus on here, is in table 4. I have this table also in our pages, which we'll have a look at. So again, you can look at your own information for your own age bracket. But again, the primary program here, meaning the first 2 doses, so for people under 30, you would need to vaccinate in order to prevent 1 severe hospitalization, 166,000 people. In regards to the booster, how many people would you need to give the booster to in order to prevent 1 severe hospitalization? Was 418,000 people. And again, that's for the 20 to 29-year-old age group. And for the autumn booster for the 4th dose, you would need to give over 250,000 doses to prevent a single case of hospitalization. So just to summarize so far, from the Pfizer randomized controlled trial data that got the mRNA vaccines approved, your absolute risk reduction was 0.84%, so less than 1%. We have also now looked at the worst case scenario for COVID. And again, for most people, the infection fatality rate still less than 1%. We now know the number of people that you would have to give the vaccine to prevent severe hospitalization, ran into the over 100,000 people for people in my age group, still in many thousands for the vast majority of people. The last question you might ask, well, what is the chance of, what are the downsides to getting the vaccine? I know if I go into a pharmacy and I pick up any drug in there and I read the label of it, there's a long list of complications that can occur. Thankfully, an independent analysis has been done on the vaccine trial data. So it's not sponsored by the big pharmaceutical companies who are there to profit from these kind of things. And again, I will call up the paper for that first. This was published in September of 2022. It is titled "The Serious Adverse Events of Special Interest Following the mRNA COVID-19 Vaccination." And this was the data that was published by the pharmaceutical companies themselves. Again, you can look up the authors here yourself. For the sake of brevity, we'll not do that for this time. The methods. This is where they reanalyzed the serious adverse events reported in the placebo-controlled trials. They looked at both Pfizer and the Moderna trials as well. Now, what do they mean by serious adverse events? This is the definition that came from it. Pfizer and Moderna used nearly identical definitions, consistent with the regulatory expectations. A serious adverse event was defined as an adverse event that results in any of the following conditions: death, life-threatening at the time of the event, inpatient hospitalization or prolongation of existing hospitalization, persistent or significant disability or incapacity, a congenital anomaly or birth defect, or a medically important event based on medical judgment. So the results of this independent analysis of the randomized controlled trial data showed that combined, the mRNA vaccines were associated with an excess risk of serious adverse events of special interest of 12.5 people per 10,000 people vaccinated. Another way of expressing that is about 1 in 800. So our absolute risk reduction from the trial data, 0.84%. The number of people needed to vaccinate with these things ran into the tens of thousands. And moreover, the risk of serious adverse event was about 1 in 800. So I'll let you come to your own conclusion regarding all of this. That's what I'll leave you with today. Thank you for stopping by,